Patrick from Patrick and Friends Music Company, and today we're going to start to learn how to solo on guitar. Now, the first step to learning how to solo is to develop your vocabulary. Learning to solo is directly like learning a language. Just like you have to develop your speaking vocabulary, you have to develop your musical vocabulary to be able to solo. When you learned your first language, you probably started off with a couple of easy vocabulary words, whether it was bowl, cup, door, mat, mom, and so forth. Then you learned your ABCs, the letters that make up that vocabulary. And then you learned how to form sentences, making coherent ideas out of that vocabulary and those letters. Now, learning to solo is directly linked to these steps. You want to be able to develop your musical vocabulary just like you're developing your speaking vocabulary. Then, just like you learn your ABCs and those letters, you want to learn your notes, scales, and arpeggios that make up that musical vocabulary and then fill in the gaps. And then finally, you want to learn how to phrase, which is like forming sentences. It's taking that vocabulary, taking those notes, scales, and arpeggios, and putting it together to form coherent musical ideas. A common problem I see is when people first start to learn how to solo, what they do is they typically learn a scale and try to solo using that scale. Although this won't sound bad and the notes will still sound good, what will happen is it won't sound like a typical solo because it's missing that vocabulary. Now, this is because scales are a good vehicle to learn how to solo, but they shouldn't be the only basis of your solo. If we go back to our language analogy and we have the sentence, I walk my dog and go to the park, that's a completely normal sentence and anyone would know what you're saying. However, if you replace just two vocabulary words in that sentence, it may sound a little weird. If I say, I walked my foot and go to the quickly, that would make absolutely no sense at all. If you said that to someone, they would assume you don't know how to speak that language. Now, this is just like in music. Each genre and each style of music has their own musical vocabulary, and this encompasses a lot, whether it's note choice, phrases, licks, articulations, scales, scale patterns, and on and on. In general, what this translates to is playing in the correct style of the correct style of music. So, for instance, if you have a country style vocabulary being played over a metal song, it's going to sound a little bit odd. Now, if we mix two styles together, it's going to sound a little like this. Obviously, the lead sounds out of place because we're not using the correct vocabulary for this style of music. Any casual rock listener would notice something's a little bit off. Now, this is not to say that you can't break boundaries, you can't take different styles, different vocabularies, and fuse them together. There's entire genres built off the ideas of fusing two genres together. Now, what you may not know or notice, though, is that these musicians that are able to do this have foundational vocabulary in each style. So, for instance, a jazz fusion player has vocabulary in jazz and vocabulary in rock and is able to put them together. Now, this is what we're talking about today. We're talking about building that foundational vocabulary in that style or genre. Now, the big question is, how do we develop vocabulary? It can sound like more of a concept rather than a definitive practice strategy. Now, to be honest, a lot of times people do develop vocabulary over time. If you learn enough music and play enough music, you'll start to learn and notice this vocabulary. However, I've had the opportunity to learn from and speak to a bunch of amazing musicians and soloists. And the three steps they all talk about when developing vocabulary, and the three steps we're going to talk about today, is to learn, steal, and incorporate. Now, to really learn, you really want to dive deep into the music. You want to actively listen and actively learn. Now, this means not just putting on music and relaxing or going on your phone, or just learning a solo and forgetting about it. You really want to analyze it and really pay attention. Now, what you really want to pay attention to is basically everything. How do they use scales? How do they use scale patterns? How do they phrase? How do they bend? How do they articulate? How do they pick? You want to absorb everything you possibly can from these great musicians and these great soloists. Now, when you learn enough music, what you notice is that there's a common vocabulary amongst different musicians in the same style or genre. And then within that vocabulary, each musician has their own stylistic nuances and interpretations. Now, this goes back to our language analogy. We have many different languages around the world, but within one language by itself, there's many different accents, slang, and styles. After you really dive into the learning process, the next step is to steal. Now, do not feel bad about stealing. Obviously, when you go to record, there's a lot of music that is off limits, such as melody, riffs, recordings, entire solos. However, there's a lot of music that's not off limits, and when you practice nothing is off limits. Now, a great way to start off stealing is to steal licks or phrases, and licks are just common musical cliches or ideas that you hear played over and over again. For example, this is a common rock lick. Now, once you learn that, what you want to do is move the different keys by moving it up and down the fretboard. What you can also do is kind of change the set of strings that a lick might be on. So for example, this lick starts on the D and the G strings. However, I can also start on the A and the D strings. Again, this is to get it underneath your fingers and really get comfortable using that. Now, stealing licks is just the beginning. You want to be able to steal everything we talked about before. Note choice, scales, scale patterns, how someone bends, how they articulate, how they pick, and so on. Now, what you can do is sort of take an idea and put it into your own playing. So for example, says a scale pattern that you picked up. That one was in our first minor pentatonic shape. Then move it to your second minor pentatonic shape. Then change it to a different scale. This all will really help you get these licks, phrases, concepts, scales, scale patterns really underneath your fingers. Now, the last step is to incorporate. And this is taking everything we stole, everything we learned, and actually using it to solo. Now, you used to have to do this by going to a jam session and working everything out or playing with some friends. And this is probably still the best way to go about doing this. However, there's so many resources out there for us to really practice this. And this includes backing tracks online, backing tracks you can buy. You can record your own backing track on your computer, phone, or through an app. Now, what you want to do is take everything you stole and everything you learned and put it into your playing intentionally. And this is going to sound a little forced and a little unnatural at first because you're taking something you're not used to playing and playing it. However, the things that stick with you musically and naturally will come out in a more musical and more natural way, and the things that don't won't stick with you. Developing vocabulary is the first step for anyone learning how to solo. Without the correct vocabulary, it's going to sound like you're speaking the wrong musical language. The 3 steps we talked about to be able to develop vocabulary is to learn, steal, and incorporate. Now, remember through this process to have fun. Soloing is a fun process to learn how to do, and sometimes you just gotta throw on a backing track and just go for it. Now, I hope to see you in the next video, but in the meantime, happy practicing.